Welcome back to Fourby and welcome back to the workshop. In the last Toylander video you saw the girls take the newly built Toylander around the park, and you might have noticed from the soundtrack that there was a lot of grumbling coming from the car, and I've decided to investigate that and see if I can find out what's the problem. So I've stripped down one of the motors and the gearboxes from the car, and I've pulled it apart just to see what's inside and see if I can find any bad bearings or in need of lubrication. So I'll take you over quickly. We'll have a quick look at the Toylander, and I'll show you where I am with this gearbox. Now here is the Toylander sat on its side, and this here is the wheel arch, and you can see the subframe which I've fabricated to mount the motors on the underside. And we've took the motor off and took the gearbox off, and we've got it apart, we've got it on the bench. So I'll bring you in and you can have a look to see where we're at with that. So we're here at the workbench and we've deconstructed the motor, and let me show you through the parts. The first part to come off was the stub axle, and the wheel attached directly onto here, and that itself had a little key that went into that little keyway slot there, and it had a bolt and a washer that held it on. Put those to one side. These are all the fixings that came out the motor, and this is the motor and the gearbox unit itself. On the top of the motor is a brake, and this is basically a solenoid, and it has this little plate that fits on there, little pressure plate, and this pad which is basically a brake pad, and that itself fits onto the square on the top of the motor, and pressure applied onto there basically puts the brakes on. Now the motor controller is clever enough to disconnect the brakes and reapply the brakes when it senses throttle activity. So the moment you press the throttle, you might have heard it on the video, you hear the click, and the click is this solenoid kicking in and retracting to take the pressure off this brake pad. So we'll put those to one side as well. And what we got here is the main gearbox, and this I believe is where the issue is coming from. So we took out all the fixings from the gearbox and we've split it, and there was a gasket in here, but it's rubbish now and it's got in the bin. And what we find inside is quite a nice looking brass gear and a worm drive. Now on top of the worm drive, if I pull that out, is this little, it's like a Lovejoy connector. It's got a cush drive, and that mates with a corresponding one on the motor. Now these bearings here, these seem pretty sound. I mean, you hold these in your hand, this feels silky smooth. I don't think we need to play with that. The oil in here, I put that in a little bit earlier tonight. I was messing around with it, trying to quieten it down, and I discovered these two things here, these two little brass screws, and it looks like these are fillers for putting in some form of lubrication. Now I've no idea what that lubrication would be. You know, this was part of a mobility scooter that I bought second hand and cannibalised it for the parts. So without the original manual for the scooter, I don't know what the service intervals would be, and I don't know what the oil would be, but we are going to run it with a little bit of lubrication when you put it back together. Whether or not that's a heavy duty oil or a grease, I haven't decided yet, but we're going to investigate into this further. So what we found when we did investigate was these little bearings here. They're tiny. In fact, they're skateboard bearings, and as it happens, being skateboard bearings, I got a couple of brand new ones knocking around the workshop. So we've got a lot of play in that. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but there is an immense amount of play in that. And the other thing as well is when these are in situ here inside the gearbox, when the motor spins, it's almost like screwing a screw into wood. This is going to rotate, and it's going to want to force this shaft to go up and down. Well, these are ball bearings. They're not angular contact bearings, and they're certainly not thrust bearings, which is probably why they've worn to the extent they have. And I believe this top bearing here is the cause of all our growling. What I might do is just set up and measure the numbers on this, the deflection, and we'll see what we can do about changing these two bearings for these two bearings. So let me get set up for that, and we'll just take down some numbers and see if we can improve on it and see if it actually makes a difference. But what I've done is I've clamped this bearing into the vise, and we've got the indicator set at the other end, and we're just going to see just how much run out we've got on here. So let's just zero that in. So we're reading about, let's see, that's 1 millimetre. Got about 2 mil of run out on here. Now this is far from accurate because the shaft is actually moving very slightly in the vise. I didn't want to clamp it too hard, but you can now see just the amount of play that's in that bearing, and when I rotate this you can see the vibrations going through the shaft. So I've got a feeling this is the cause of our growl, and what we need to do is press out these bearings and put some new ones on. Quite a nice gear this, it's been cut really well, that spiral worm gear, but what we do need to do is make some sort of fork that we can get in under here without damaging these surfaces and press it out. So let's just see what we got there across that. So if we go with an 11mm, perfect. Okay, let's see how we get on with this. Okay, that's one half of the Lovejoy. Now we need to do the same for the bearing. So we made exactly the same tool for the bearing, it's just that we put an 11mm slot in there, and we'll see if this will punch out. If it doesn't, we'll take it over to the press and we'll give it a touch more force, but I'm hoping with not too much effort it will just pop through here. Going in the bin, and we're going to put some new bearings on, so let's just have a quick look at the shaft and see if we can make a difference to the graunchy noise that was coming out of this Toylander. Back in the gearbox. There is a touch of slop in the housing. Alright, let's get this Lovejoy connector on there. And what I'm going to do think, is drop it on with a touch of Loctite. It ain't gonna hurt. I don't know if you can see there, there's a little bit of red colour on that flat. Maybe when it was first assembled they used Loctite on it too. So we've got a clean rag, and this is a nail polish remover, and we're just gonna give that surface there a bit of a clean before we put some Loctite on it. So we've got these little O-ring seals that help seal whatever lubrication is going to go in there, and these sit just on the outside of the bearings like that. I'll drop these in, we'll get a bit of goo around there, put a bit of lube in it and seal it up. There we go. All of a sudden that feels much better. Okay, let's get some goo on the perimeter and get these two halves back together. So what we got here is an RTV silicone gasket maker. Now this one's an ultra high temperature, but it's all I've got, so this is what we're going to use. Now I don't know if you've seen this stuff before, but I'm a massive advocate for it. It's actually an oil stabilizer, but you can use it neat in differentials for high pressure situations, and you know what, let's chuck some in, see how we get on. Stuff's like honey. Okay, we'll get this set up in the vise and we'll pin the two back together. And it's beautifully silky smooth. So I went out earlier and visited Sega Bearings, who are our local bearing supplier, and they are brilliant in there. They've been around for generations and they really know their stuff. And I bought a couple of fag bearings. In fact, I bought 6 of them because I've done the other gearbox and the other motor off camera, and I found in the motors they've got the same bearings, so I figured in for a penny, in for a pound, might as well replace the lot and completely recondition these power units. So here's the motor, and this, I'm going to say, is a really good quality motor. It says here made in Poland, and the bearings that came out also say made in Poland, and I've only ever had good experiences with Polish made bearings. For some reason they get it right. Anyway, we've got this motor, and it's rated at 200 watts, which, as there's going to be two of them in the Toylander, we've got 400 watts at the motor, and 400 watts is approximately half a horsepower. And I don't know what the ratio is between here and here, but we've got half a horsepower going into going into the combined two gearboxes, and the torque is being multiplied by the worm gear. So we've got quite a powerful little car all in all. Now, for those of you that don't know what a horsepower is, I'll explain very quickly. I've never been particularly good at drawing, but I'll have a go for you. Now, a horsepower was always designed, let me draw a horse. There's my horse, and there's his head and some ears. A horsepower was always defined, let's give him an eye as well, and a smile. A horsepower was always defined as the amount of energy required to lift a man. You know what, let's stick it round his neck, shall we? To lift a man half of his height in 1 second. So he's got to go up half his distance by that horse, and the amount of energy required to do that is a horsepower. Now, metric horsepower, I believe to be somewhere in the region of about 740 watts, something like that. I'll have to check, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But if we've got 200 watts on each of the motors, combine the two motors together, we've got 400 watts. We've got approximately half a horsepower coming out of the motor array. Let's get rid of this. So here's the motor. I've already had this disassembled already once because I wanted to find out what bearings were in there, but I'll show you very quickly what I did. I used a couple of breaker bars, levers, whatever you want to call them, and I popped off the Lovejoy connector. And then on the top of the motor was 3 set screws that held in this cap. The bearing was on the end of the motor spindle there, and it fitted inside the bore in the cap, and the same on the other side. So this is the side where we've got the motor brushes, and there was a bearing here, and it fitted into this bearing cap, and the bearing cap acts as one side of the brake shoe. So what we're going to do is we're going to put some more bearings, some new bearings onto these, and reassemble the motor and see if we've made a difference in terms of the grinding noise that was coming out of these motor units. So we're replacing the, in my opinion, the quality Polish bearings with some decent FAG made bearings. I think FAG are German. And what I'm going to do is tap them in with my soft hammer. Now on the back side of the motor we had the square, and this is a bit of brass or a bit of bronze, and that fits onto the back of the motor shaft, and it's pinned into place with a little pin. See if we can get those lined up. Let's get the pin in there. There we go. I don't know if you can see that. And there's the pin, and that gets pinned through. Find a punch. Just a little bit proud. I need to get it just on the surface there so that we can get the brake disc back on. I think that pin might still be just a touch proud. Let's give it one more wallop. Oh no, it's under. Beg your pardon. Right, so the Lovejoy connector next, and we'll do that in the same way. We'll chuck a bit of Loctite on it and put it back on the shaft. And as you can see, the shaft is keyed. It's a D-shaped shaft. So we're just going to drop a bit of Loctite on there and put that drive flange back on for the Lovejoy connector. There we go, motor with new bearings. So I think what we'll do is we'll put the motor back onto the gearbox, and there was this phenolic ring that went on there. We've got the motor unit and the gearbox reassembled. I've got it clamped in the vise. I've got a couple of wires just rigged up, and we'll give it a test on a battery. And that is perfect. All that remains to do now is get this reinstalled back in the Toylander, and the girls can go out and play with it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one.